Hello and welcome to the Spaces virtual conference on the theme of Net Zero Carbon, Climate Emergency 2021. My name is Greg Keeling and I'm your chair for this webinar. Before commencing with my introduction of our speaker, I'd like to thank our 5 sponsors today: Atkins, Faithful & Gould, IES, MPS Group and Wilmot Dixon for their support. All the webinars over the next 2-week period are being recorded and will be loaded to the Spaces YouTube channel. The recordings are only available to delegates and Spaces members, and you'll be sent a link at the end of this conference. If you have any questions during the presentation, please include them in the chat box and we will answer them towards the end. Please do ask questions, as this will make the session more interactive and enjoyable for everyone. This morning's webinar is entitled The Challenge of Zero Carbon in the Housing Sector and will be presented by Dr. Laura Mansel Thomas. Laura is a chartered engineer, a fellow of FCIBSE and a senior partner at Ingleton Wood. And she also volunteers to be one of the Essex County Council Commissioners to help us develop our climate change strategy. Today, she'll be focusing on housing and the need for rapid progress towards zero carbon. Laura will be talking through the challenges of both new build and existing, and very importantly, providing us with her own thoughts and solutions. Laura, welcome. Thank you for supporting our conference, and we now look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Greg. There we go. Hopefully you can see that first slide. So thank you. My name's Laura Mansel Thomas. As Greg said, I'm a chartered engineer at Ingleton Wood. We're a multidisciplinary building consultancy based across the southeast of England, Essex, London, with 6 offices and about 200 people. So I head up our sustainability and M&E sector. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenge of zero carbon in housing. Really what I want to talk about is why it seems so difficult to achieve, why we've got such a problem getting there. So I'll talk a bit about the definition of zero carbon, the background to the definition. I'll talk about why it should be easy to achieve, how we might reach it, and talk a little bit about the challenge of embodied carbon and how we deal with retrofit. I think the two are quite closely linked. And I'll touch on how we know if we've actually got a zero carbon building. So the modern concept of zero carbon dates back to 2008 and the Climate Change Act. This obviously covers far more than buildings, but really it simply mandates an 80% reduction in carbon dioxide from the 1990 levels, which is taken as the baseline, by 2050. Crucially, the Act also formed the Committee on Climate Change, which is now changed to the Climate Change Committee, to advise the United Kingdom and the devolved governments and parliaments on how to tackle and prepare for climate change. And they produce regular reports looking at how far we've got and how far we have to go to meet those targets. And that's a great place to start, I would say, for anyone looking at this, those reports, to go back to that base data and really look at those reports on how we're doing. Really does give us a really good understanding of where we are and what the challenges are. So I think it's fair to say that rapid progress towards zero carbon in the built environment is essential if we're going to meet the challenge of climate change. I think also it's important to note that direct greenhouse gas emissions from buildings account for about 17% of the total emissions in the UK. This is a Climate Change Committee report from 2018, but it's pretty valid still today. And in the next slide, we can see why housing is so important in this as well. So again, this comes from the same 2018 report. But what you can see is that residential in the red makes up over 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions for buildings. So even if you're looking at buildings as a whole, not just housing, actually housing is the most important part of that. And the Climate Change Committee said in their report in 2018 that meeting the 2050 targets is simply not possible without near complete decarbonisation of the entire housing stock. But the UK government hasn't really got an adopted definition of what zero carbon means, which doesn't help. I think we all know what we think it means. I guarantee that each of us will give a slightly different answer, a slightly different definition. I included the image here of the Green Building Council definition. That's 47 pages long. I've also included the Office for National Statistics definition of what net zero means. And I'll come back on this because actually what we're trying to achieve at the end of it all is a total greenhouse gas emissions in the UK that's equal or less than the emissions removed from the environment. So we can achieve that by emissions reduction, emissions removal, but we need to balance it across all the sectors. But if we don't know what zero carbon means in terms of buildings, we really can't compare apples with apples. And so we do need to understand a bit what we're talking about. So I'm going to put in a bit of background, and I'm sorry if it's something that everybody already knows, but I think it's really useful to think about where we've come from in terms of how we define zero carbon and what we include in those calculations. So in December 2006, the Labour government committed that from 2016, all new homes would be zero carbon. To achieve this, they introduced the Code for Sustainable Homes, against which sustainability of all new homes could be rated. They then confirmed that commitment in their policy statement, which was called Building a Greener Future, the next year, 2007. And what they were looking at then was progressively tightening the building regulations to achieve that 2016 goal, first by 25% in 2010, and then by 44% in 2013. But to cut a long story short here, and it is a very long story and very convoluted, after 2015, after the election, the whole policy landscape changed and the zero carbon target was scrapped. Months after it came into effect, the Code for Sustainable Homes and the Zero Carbon Hub were both also scrapped. Although for those of you interested, the Zero Carbon Hub website is still there and it is a fount of knowledge. The aim was valid. The aim was to simplify the system and bring all of these targets into building regulations. But I think we can probably all say that so far that hasn't really happened. So we know that there was confusion back then about what they meant by zero carbon, as well as a lot of skepticism about whether those ambitious targets could actually be met. And now in 2021, we know that the 2016 targets simply came and went. So back then, the first definition of a zero carbon home was a home achieving level 6 of the Code for Sustainable Homes. And this importantly included emissions of both regulated energy, and regulated is the space heating, the hot water, the lighting, the ventilation, the bits that we put in when we design a building, as well as the unregulated energy, the appliances and cooking. And Greg and I were talking before this meeting about meeting passive house requirements, where you're looking at unregulated energy. And it is incredibly difficult to start to look at a house or a school or any other kind of building to look at that unregulated energy. So the example here, which is Mendip Place, is a code level 6 development that Ingleton Wood designed in Chelmsford. And it was the first affordable housing scheme to reach level 6 back in 2010-11. And to achieve this, the dwellings didn't really do anything special by today's standards. They were fitted with PVs, they had a biomass boiler providing district heating, there was rainwater harvesting, waste compost facilities, and the building was very well insulated using a SIP panel system and a mix, as you can see, of brick and rendered cladding that gives a relatively traditional look to the building. The roof you can see here is oriented to the south to maximise that solar collection. And then after the buildings were complete, we did some post-occupancy monitoring, looking at how much energy was really being used, so trying to capture some of that unregulated energy. And what we did find, which is a whole different topic, is that a number of these properties were performing better, in fact, than we'd predicted. So I guess the reason for using this as an example is that even back in 2010, so this was being designed in 2007, 8, 9, it was perfectly possible to reach zero carbon, to achieve a zero carbon house. So in the 2011 budget, the coalition government confirmed the commitment that from 2016 all new homes would be zero carbon, But what the change they made then was to exclude unregulated energy from the definition. And as we said, it's understandable why they do that. It's very difficult to control, very difficult to monitor. People feel they're being told how they need to operate their own homes. But the closest definition that we then came to, and I think this is the closest we've got to an agreed meaning of zero carbon, is what's shown in the image here. And this is the zero carbon hub definition. And it's strongly based on the building regulations, and that explains really why the unregulated energy bit needed to be dropped. So in England, the definition of a zero carbon home became one where carbon dioxide emissions from regulated energy were limited or mitigated by 3 factors, the first 2 of which are known as the carbon compliance standards, and these still form the basis of a lot of our ways of thinking today. And I'll just quickly talk through those because they really are how we still think about zero carbon. So the first step is the fabric energy efficiency standards, and the aim of these was to ensure a good new minimum standard for fabric, this being the longest lasting part of the home. It's the fabric first approach that we're all very familiar with, and the idea was that this would be embedded into all new homes. Importantly, it's also measured in kilowatt hours per square metre per year, so it's not affected by carbon emission factors for different fuel types. And in this way, as an approach, it's not dissimilar to the push now towards looking at embodied energy that we'll come on to in a minute. So the next step after looking at the fabric is the carbon compliance limit. And this is the maximum amount of carbon dioxide arising from the home's heating, cooling, fixed lighting, ventilation systems. Again, it's not unusual in the way we're used to thinking about things now, so it still forms the basis and it's still worth looking at and going back to. And then probably the controversial bit was the allowable solutions. And this meant that wherever emissions couldn't be reduced to zero on site, the remaining carbon emissions could be mitigated through a list of allowable off-site solutions. These could be tackled through nearby measures. One of the popular ones was providing PVs onto schools. We did a number of times. Or it could be through remote measures, such as funding of wind farms and a number of other solutions that came in. So in effect, any developers would have to avoid or mitigate all the regulated emissions using a combination of on-site energy efficiency, on-site zero carbon technologies, and off-site measures to deal with any remaining emissions. Now, moving forward, in the 2019 report from the Climate Change Committee on whether the UK's housing stock was fit for the future, the Climate Change Committee concluded that policies have been weakened or withdrawn, which led to many new homes being built only to the minimum standards for energy efficiency. And they noted that just 1% of new homes in 2018 were actually EPC Band A. Along with this, they noted that low carbon heat and energy efficiency uptakes in existing homes had stalled, including the uptake of very cost-effective measures such as loft insulation. And this is a graph from that report, and it really does tell a stark picture. If you look at how much work was going into things like loft insulation in existing homes up until about 2011-12, and the extent to which this dropped off after that. And this all paints a little bit of a negative picture, I guess, but actually we're talking 2019, and around the time of this report, things were really starting to change. And I think the drive here came from the private sector. The private sector were asking how to build zero carbon homes. It came from large business who were interested. They I guess, felt that that consumers, that clients were starting to be interested in zero carbon. They wanted to see that businesses they worked with were sustainable. There was pressure from government, from the EU, worldwide pressure. And actually things really did start to change. And I think in those last couple of years, sustainability really has started to become mainstream. people started to believe that sustainability mattered. It started to become, it has now become an important part in decisions, whether it's buying a house, buying clothes, buying food. And this is an article from The Guardian in March of this year. This is the Solar Avenue development in Leeds. And they cite it as an example of zero carbon housing really hitting the mainstream. And I think it's showing the public that, or showing that the public really started to want zero carbon homes. And there's a real zeitgeist now that we really need to buy into. There's some other great examples, and I really like these ones from Exeter Council. The council is now in its 7th generation of low energy housing. So they've honed it over the years. They say to make it as idiot proof as possible. Many of their houses, I believe these ones, this example included, as passive house standards. And if you look at these examples, they're simple houses. There's nothing complicated. They don't look particularly different apart from the colour. But they're really providing something that people want. And probably couldn't go past to talk about zero carbon and passive house homes without looking at Goldsmith Street in Norwich. Most of us in the east of England will be familiar with this scheme. It's 93 homes to a passive house standard, and it won the Sterling Prize in 2019. And this was a scheme for Norwich City Council. It's interesting that Norwich City Council say they were very influenced by the social housing providers around the east of England who were pushing that passive house agenda and starting to show that this was possible. It was possible to build really beautiful houses, really high quality at scale as well. And if you look at it in a view like this, you can see that the scheme is fairly traditional. It's 4 traditional looking streets. It's a mix of 2 to 4 bed houses and 1 to 3 bed flats. And if there's such great examples, that it just does make you wonder why everyone isn't doing it. I think there's still a perception that it's prohibitively expensive to design and achieve such great energy performance. On the Goldsmith Street scheme here, for example, the architects note that they made some really big early savings in brickwork, in the roof package, in the foundations, to allow the passive house features to be safeguarded. And I think that kind of coordinated design and costing approach is key. Too often we see a building that's designed and then it's asked to make it zero carbon afterwards, or how can I make this building better, rather than taking that as the premise from the very start. As an example, actually, as another image from this same project, which is so simple. And this is a diagram from the architects, from Michael Riches, showing how early attention to design really can manage solar gains and overshadowing without the need for any costly extras. Where if you look to the south, each successive street allows solar access to the previous one, so that all the buildings get that warming winter sun. There's some very simple shading from the high level summer sun to prevent overheating in summer. But all of it's done without really any extra design features, so no extra cost, just by simple good design. But you can see from the scale we're looking at here, this isn't looking at one window or one facade or even one house. This is looking at the design from the very start. It's saying this is the plot we've got, this is the orientation of the buildings, excuse me. And this is how we start to reduce costs in low energy, zero carbon housing, is by really coordinating it from the very start. And actually, if you go back and look at this in a bit more detail with my M&E hat on, the coordinated approach is really evident in the services design as well. You can't see any meter cupboards, you can't see ventilation intakes, you can't see gas pipe risers. It's all completely integrated into the architecture. So it's been thought about from the very start. So I think this is my most important take-home point here about zero carbon. It's not a technical one. It's that we can only really achieve good low carbon or zero carbon design through a fully coordinated approach, where clients have got a brief that they want to follow through with, where architects, engineers, cost consultants, and where possible end users sit down and decide what they want, and that thread gets followed through from start to finish. I just included this because I think it's quite interesting, and it's important that that not everyone wants outstanding award-winning architecture, but they might simply want a house that looks like all the other houses around. And this is a CGI of a zero carbon home that's being developed by Persimmon Persimmon Homes. Persimmon wanted to see how far they could get with standard masonry construction, adding more insulation, improving the windows, adding an air source heat pump. I presume those are solar panels on the roof. And they claim to have got to zero carbon for about 15% extra cost. So I think there's two things I'd argued here. The first point would be that taking a standard design and then pushing it towards zero carbon isn't going to be the most cost-effective approach, as we've just seen. I think the second point, though, is that if we're talking about 15% additional costs here, we might be talking about that over a very low baseline. And perhaps we shouldn't see this as an additional cost at all, but just the cost of building good housing. One other thing I wanted to touch on was having mentioned Passive House, and this one isn't, but the previous ones are, is I think it's important that Passive House doesn't need to be the only approach to zero carbon. It's a really thorough certification process, but it can be prohibitively expensive for some projects. And there's really important things we can take from Passive House designs and use elsewhere. So I'll come on to it at the end, but that's my second take-home point, I guess, is that we don't have an assessment tool for zero carbon. And so Passive House is seen to be the only game in town. And we do need a simple, coordinated assessment tool that allows us all to know how to design to reach zero carbon, but also how we know when we've got there. So a client knows they've got a zero carbon building and they know how to keep it working in that way. So a little bit of technical detail. I said what we can take from Passive House and from successful zero carbon developments. And actually, if you go back to passive housing as opposed to Passive House in the 70s, it's not that different. So we can the principles are really, really simple. So similar to Passive House, zero carbon homes are almost always built to be completely airtight, and they're almost always exceptionally well insulated. This is really important. It's about controlling energy and airflow. It's not about keeping air out or heat out, but it's about controlling those flows through the building. So whether it's winter and heating or summer and keeping cool. The plots can be orientated, so windows can be deliberately located on the north and south side of homes to maximise the ability to absorb heat in winter and to minimise it in summer. It's much easier to treat sun on a south facade than it is on an east or west facade. But where that isn't possible, we can always look at additional ways of treating east and west facade windows to make sure that we get the solar gain we want and not the solar gain that we don't want. And the Norwich scheme showed that perfectly. And it does mean incorporating sustainability into the building form from the very outset. Unwanted air leakage can significantly increase heating requirements and cause uncomfortable drafts. You can have moisture build up in building materials, and Passive House levels of air tightness really eliminate these problems. And they require careful use of appropriate membranes, very careful detailing, but there's no magic there. There's no magic tick box about Passive House. And similarly, the removal of thermal bridges, careful construction detailing is needed to ensure that junctions don't create unnecessary heat paths. Again, approaches such as external insulation have a major advantage in reducing thermal bridges, but strategic placement of insulation around junction details can really help that convective heat loss. I think that the air change rate here is really important. Just quickly, as anyone who's lived in a drafty Victorian house that hasn't been properly maintained will know, a lot of the heat loss, if you do some calculations on it, is through that airflow. It's through windows that don't seal properly. It's through timber floors with voids underneath and gaps. And it is very important to think about airflow, whether it's a new build or a retrofit. So the other thing I think that we'll take as a principle for zero carbon housing is to think that because electricity generation is becoming cleaner and cleaner, zero carbon homes won't have natural gas. And if you look at this graph here, this is simply showing the emission intensity for electricity dropping from 2017. It's incredibly significant, this drop, and really does change the way that we think about how we heat and service our homes. It's not a requirement for Passive House. In fact, the Norwich scheme has gas, but I do think that all energy consumption will eventually go purely electric. Certainly haven't got time to really talk about hydrogen here. I think that's probably a transitionary approach where we can use the gas grid to feed hydrogen-rich gas to existing homes and adapted boilers. But I'm absolutely sure that the future will be electric. So probably this means ground source or air source heat pumps, using the Earth's relative temperature to heat and cool the home very efficiently. And then all these design choices start to work together to achieve a maximum energy efficiency for a property. So once we've reduced that energy efficiency, renewable energy can be generated with solar panels, sometimes home-scale wind turbines or other renewable energy sources, but it needs to be sized appropriately to try and get that total annual energy consumption so we get that net zero. And remembering, of course, solar panels will produce more electricity on sunny days, nothing at night, and less in the winter. So we do need that grid connection. We're talking about a net balance, not necessarily off-grid. So we can deal with the operational energy in these zero carbon houses, and that's taking that definition of zero carbon, and that's the closest one we've got at the moment. But I think you could very well argue that this doesn't really achieve true zero carbon. This chart you may recognise, and I think you've got a talk later this week from LETI, which is the London Energy Transformation Initiative. It's a fantastic document. And this chart really does show how important the embodied carbon is over the life of a building. If you look at those operational emissions in orange and you look at the embodied carbon in red, and if you also imagine that you're driving that operational energy down and down, that embodied carbon will become more and more important. And so focusing just on operating emission definition of zero carbon, rather than including those capital emissions, really doesn't get us the whole way. And currently the GLA is the only authority that's really looking at the life cycle of materials. And the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide is a great resource here. And this clearly defines net zero carbon as meaning the whole life carbon. I think I've got something on the next page. Yeah, so it talks about operational carbon and it talks about embodied carbon, and it defines them both. And I think if we talk about what zero carbon means, that's our definition for the future. So the actual definition of operational carbon is broadly in line with the earlier definition of zero carbon. It doesn't allow for any offsetting to meet the target, and the embodied carbon comes in to produce, if you add the two together, a whole life carbon definition for carbon zero. So as we drive down the operational carbon, I think my fourth key point is probably that we can't ignore embodied carbon anymore. As that operational part gets lower and lower, and we have the technology to really drive that down, we really have to start looking at embodied carbon. So if a building is operationally zero carbon, but has taken a huge amount of carbon or energy to build, even if it operates very efficiently once built, it's not telling us the whole picture about that building. Embodied carbon includes carbon emissions from extracting, processing, manufacturing, packaging, transporting materials, as well as the construction on site, as well, and the maintenance, as you saw from that previous graph. So, and what happens after the building's demolished. So it really does acknowledge that the problem we're trying to solve is a global one, and to look at it as purely about an operational building really isn't good enough. Sorry, I've jumped ahead of myself here. So whilst dealing with operational carbon, I think in many cases we can do it without changing much about the overall appearance of the building. Dealing with embodied carbon could potentially have a much greater effect. Glass, steel, concrete, and materials with the highest carbon impact, and more sustainable low carbon options include brick, stone, timber, and things like cross-laminated timber. So you're talking about potentially different ways of designing and building houses. And the numbers really do speak for themselves, and it is important to understand this, that steel is responsible for about 7% of global carbon dioxide emissions, and cement for about 8%. Steel, this is largely about the heating and the process involved in making it, so there's not a lot you can do about that. And with concrete and cement, a lot of it is simply due to the vast amount in use, the widespread use as cities develop very rapidly. There's a lot of work being done on lower carbon sustainable concrete, but the cement is really the issue. So timber has much lower embodied carbon, and based on calculations, CLT, cross-laminated timber is actually a carbon negative material in that it sequesters more carbon than it emits. This is just a timber frame, obviously not a CLT example, but CLT is grown from trees and made from trees that grow for about 40 years in managed forests. They're cut, they're pressed together with adhesive, and the trees absorb and sequester carbon as they grow. So CLT, there's lots of different calculations on this, but effectively it absorbs somewhere around 600 kilograms of carbon dioxide per cubic meter. And of course, it's also strong enough that you can use it structurally. It's very quick construction, very, very low waste. So in terms of current design approach, a common one is to think about less concrete, less steel and more timber. But no matter how streamlined the process of construction, it will always emit some carbon, especially if demolition's involved. So the future of design and construction also lies in successful green retrofit projects. That will be far more significant than new builds, and this does go on to my last point. So typically every year, new homes account for something like 1% of the total housing stock. So we focus a lot on how to design new zero carbon homes. But this does mean that proposed measures that we've been talking about would take a very long time to have a significant impact on total emissions from the UK building stock. So from an embodied carbon and a whole life carbon point of view, rather than starting by thinking about building orientation or where your windows are, the first question really should be whether a new build is actually necessary and whether retrofit can be considered. The other thing about retrofit that I think is important is that the magnitude of retrofitting existing housing means we're unlikely, and I think we won't be able to meet the same levels of fabric efficiency, particularly as for a new build. So we always need to come back to think about the common sense reason of why we're doing this. Why we're doing all of this is the overall picture. It's about making the UK zero carbon. It's about making the world zero carbon. So we need to look at the bigger picture for meeting those zero carbon budgets. And probably as a town, a county, or even a country, existing properties probably get a disproportionate share, should get a disproportionate share of the carbon budget, which might mean we want new houses to overperform to balance the inevitable underperformance of existing properties. So important not to just look at one house against another house. So the first step when we're looking at an energy retrofit will be to look at an energy audit and understand where any current issues lie, to look at the next steps. So we then follow with a sequence to determine the measures that we'd need to take. So before we even get into doing anything, maintenance is the critical one. And I'm sure this is as valid in public sector or private sector, but whether we're considering a single dwelling or large social housing, maintaining the home is the main way that we can increase fuel efficiency, we can increase comfort, and we can allow the building to work as effectively and efficiently as possible. I think if we're looking at longer term programs, that's so important to look at as a first step in terms of saving energy, saving carbon, is simply to get the maintenance done. The next step really is exactly the same as with new build design, where we were talking earlier. We need a coordinated approach to refurbishment and retrofit, and we can't consider measures in isolation. So we'd start with a fabric first approach. We'd look at insulation, whether that's solid wall insulation, improving roofs, replacing windows, to make the properties as efficient as possible before anything else takes place. And part of this focus on the fabric, again, exactly the same as with new build, is to look at air tightness, to look at ventilation, looking at damp, making sure that the building really is operating well and that the occupants know how to operate it. And the other one I think is really important is about heritage impact. There's about 500,000 listed buildings in the UK. I've tried to find out what proportion of those are residential. I can't, if anyone knows, but you can also consider that about 5% of residential properties are in conservation areas. So even if they're not listed buildings, there's an important heritage angle here. And so coming up with proposals that don't suit a property isn't desperately helpful. And we also need to remember that heritage impact might be more subtle. So even if work isn't restricted through planning or listing, it's often worth thinking about the heritage and the aesthetic value of the property and of any changes proposed. And if we think about ownership models, so we're thinking about houses in private ownership, this really is going to be an important driver where resale value is going to be of key importance to each owner. So this leads me on to my final point, and perhaps the challenge that's most important to address now, which is there is no UK standard accreditation process for zero carbon housing or zero carbon buildings in general. This means we're all following slightly different guidelines, and much of this is good, but all are different, and we've got no way of knowing whether we've actually achieved our initial goals. There have been a number of calls for cross-industry coordinated approaches to a zero carbon accreditation, something that's simple yet robust, cost-effective, attractive to clients, designers, contractors and occupiers alike. Residents are starting to want low carbon houses, and even if they don't, they certainly want fuel efficient ones. So we can hope that a zero carbon badge will be the true badge of quality for the future. So thank you very much. I think I've finished slightly early, Greg, and really look forward to any questions.
Thank you ever so much, Laura. That was excellent. There's loads of information in there, and it's been really enjoyable to look at housing, because it's not an area that I've been involved in for many years. So I've really enjoyed that, to see what developments and what's going on. We've got some really good questions that have come in, so thank you to those who put them forward. So I'm going to start with one that's come from Graham Thomas, and this picks up on a point that I suppose recently talking to an architect and around passive house generally, and he said, well, it's quite straightforward. You just design it properly and you build it properly. And that was his kind of comment. He said, it's nothing special. You just make sure you get those basic things right. And Graham's asked a question of around building zero carbon homes requires attention to detail, which clearly it does. But then he put, how does that work when build quality standard at the moment is a real cause for concern? So it looks like good design, but maybe falls down on the construction side. What your experience has been on that, Laura?
I think that's exactly right, and I think also I'd tie into there about procurement routes as well. So passive house as an example, trying to design passive house and using a D&B route. We've had a couple of experiences with that where it's been incredibly difficult, because I may be showing my age now, but having an old school full design and having a design team who are monitoring on site properly, attention to detail, designing properly, designing down to the level of the thermal bridging, designing the insulation details. I don't think we can simply pass it all over to poor build quality standard if we're not giving contractors the details that they need in order to build to that level of quality. I think it perhaps comes back to that whole chain of connecting right through from deciding at the start what matters, passing that information through. Maybe it comes onto BIM, onto that kind of design, and that idea of a golden thread. All of these things about good design and good construction. I think there's some interesting stories there where things like passive house come across from Germany, where possibly argue that not necessarily that German contractors are better than British ones, but the skills are in different places. So a lot of the design sits within the contractors and always has done, and their design skills and knowledge. So you get an expectation that things will be built to a higher standard, and there isn't an acceptance that things might or will fail. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does really well. And just on the point which you've stressed throughout around making sure everybody works together collaboratively, and how important that is. For those people that wasn't able to join yesterday, we had Stephen Hodder from the CEng, ex-RIBA president, talking about the work that they've been doing and bringing together all the institutions. I think there was around 30 of them, and they've got a publication that's coming out today. But that webinar, if you haven't seen it, you may well enjoy watching that, and that will be available at the end of the conference. But if you go on the CIC site, there's some interesting stuff that they've been doing, bringing the institutes together, which is an amazing achievement to bring everybody together. Next question which comes in, which is interesting, and this is on existing homes, and Philip Jordan's picked up the point that it can be very difficult to fit heat pumps. What your experience is on existing?
I think it can be. I think you need to look at appropriate heat pumps for different types of housing. So the micro heat pump systems, to touch on what Nicola's asking next as well, district schemes around heat pumps as well can be really interesting, where you can fit them into existing homes. I think one of the issues that always comes up with heat pumps is about flow and return temperatures, and about heat pumps with existing radiators. And I think there's two things that we can say there. And I think the key one is probably about building fabric. It comes back to doing things right first. So you need to reduce that amount of energy loss from your building, not just look at how you provide the heat, but first look at whether you can reduce the amount of heat that's needed. And then look at whether you do need to upgrade radiators, upgrade heating systems. But I do agree they can be difficult to fit into existing homes, but I think there are solutions for probably more than we think.
Okay, that's thanks very much for that. Well, you've already touched on Nicola's question, which district heating systems, and I can remember when I first started, district heating was the thing to do in local government, and then it all started to be ripped out, and individual gas boilers were installed, including into tower blocks and flats, which in itself I can remember created huge issues just around servicing and maintenance and stuff like that, because you had to access 500 properties rather than go into a single plant room. But that's a separate issue. So the point I think Laura's raising here, will there be more emphasis on district heating and new build residential with the new CP1? And I'm not sure what CP1 is, so I'm going to put my hands up on that one.
I'm not an expert on district heating schemes. We have people at Ingleton who are, but CP1 is new guidance that's come out from CEBSE around district heating, and I think there will be more emphasis on district heating schemes. I really like the district heating. I like the idea that you can have central plants that, as technologies change, you can change that plant, and you've got a network that remains. And as you say, Greg, the move to take out district heating and put individual gas boilers in over the last 20 to 30 years is a real shame, because we're now be looking back and wishing that we'd still got that pipework there, or certainly we'd still got those routes. So I think there will. I think what technology will be fitting on the end of that district heating scheme will change if we go over to full electric schemes. But yes, I think there will be more district heating schemes where it's appropriate.
Okay, Caroline Swift's come in with a question here around social housing, and tenants are pleased to have. Are they tenants pleased to have a zero carbon home, or are they not bothered? Have you found the energy use compared with predicted energy usage depends largely on the habits of the occupants?
I think social housing tenants want a comfortable home that they know how to work, and I think if it's an overcomplicated home, whether it's zero carbon or not, I think that's where the issues come. Actually, I think there's a step further back about social housing, and certainly with the clients that we work with, there's two slightly different approaches. One is the approach that says, well, I should be building as many houses as possible to house as many people as quickly as possible, and therefore the cheapest way isn't to go down the zero carbon route. The other one is to say, well, fuel efficiency and fuel poverty is the most important thing here, and for social housing tenants, we should be building houses that are as cheap to run as possible. So I think there's the client side of it around zero carbon. In terms of energy use, and it certainly does depend on habits of the occupants. There's certainly with an M&E hat on, buildings work perfectly until you put people in them. And after that, all bets are off. What we need is we need more post occupancy evaluation. We need more monitoring. We need more funding to do that. And Greg, you and I were talking about this before we started, but we so often don't know how the buildings we've designed, or even the buildings we own and operate, how they actually work from an energy point of view. And that's critically important. We've got to get those lessons learned. Mendip Place that I showed, a number of those houses actually operated better. It perhaps comes back to the point about build quality and performance gaps and all sorts of things around whether buildings work as they were designed to work. But certainly habits of occupants, once it's your house, you're going to operate it how you want to.
Absolutely. Andrew Spencer's asked an interesting question, because it actually probably was one that I was going to ask. Living in a 50s semi that's got a gas boiler that will need replacing shortly. So Andrew's question is around the high cost of retrofitting existing housing, and do you think this will be achieved through government subsidies, or will owner occupiers have to fund it? And I believe figures I've seen are, compared to a gas boiler installation, a full heat pump and redesign is considerably more expensive.
I think it's inevitable that it will need government subsidies, or it will. It might need. It'll be the carrot and the stick. It may be that there's a cut-off date after which you cannot have gas boilers in private residential. I can't see them ever doing that. I think the only way they're ever going to do it is with government subsidies. I live in a house that's on oil. We haven't got gas. And that's possibly easier, because actually I think once the oil boiler fails, which they don't for 30, 40 years, but once they do, then I think then you can start to look at something like heat pumps. But where you're on a gas network, I think it will have to be through government subsidies. Okay,
I'm going to move on because we're getting quite a few questions coming in. Laura's asked an interesting question, and that's in relation to build quality, MMC. Yeah. Is that the way forward?
Yeah, and I think Steve, I'm just looking at these, I think Steve's comment is a similar one as well about off-site construction. I think it can. In a way, I think it's a shame. I think to feel that you have to move things to a sort of factory quality environment in order to get quality is a bit of a shame. I think it should be possible to build to a decent quality on site. But yes, I think it will certainly help. I think there's all sorts of things that MMC and off-site construction will help with around the industry. And quality is certainly one of them.
Okay, Tristram Hills asked, should EPCs be revamped to include a clear measure of carbon zero attainment?
I think it might need more than just an EPC revamp. I think it might need a rethink from the start, but in theory, yes, absolutely.
Okay, Philip Jordan's coming with a question. Considering the understandable focus on numbers, why so little attention paid to 29 million existing homes that the CCC says exist now, the majority of which will still be inhabited in 2050?
I think because it's much easier and much more fun to think about new build zero carbon homes than it is to tackle the existing homes. Actually, there is little attention. The social housing providers are way ahead of everybody else on this. And if we're working with a couple of providers who are looking to bring all their houses up to EPC C within the next couple of years, I think what will remain is houses in private ownership, which are the real problem, because they're voters as well, aren't they? These are individual people who don't want to be told what to do in their own homes, and I suspect that includes a number of us as well. As Greg says, replacing his gas boiler, or me replacing my oil boiler. It's not easy to start dealing with individual houses. I think the social housing one will be dealt with potentially quite quickly.
Okay, I've got a question from Nicola. Would we not be working towards using the Future Home Standard 2025 as a guidance for zero carbon homes?
Yes. Yes, and I think the Future Home Standards will tie in hopefully with some kind of accreditation method as well, because it doesn't have one within it. Guidance is great, but I think we also need some kind of accreditation. So yes, Nicola.
Okay, just to make people aware, we have got Dr. Jo Jack Williams presenting on LETI Climate Change Design Guide at 9 o'clock this Friday. So if you haven't registered for that one, and Jo Jack is another great presenter, so he will do a good job. So if you want to find out more about LETI, then please do that.
I'd really recommend LETI
you can
to
keep
anyone as well.
To register.
Sorry, Greg. Sorry, Greg, I think I just talked over you, but I would absolutely recommend LETI, and not just as a London guide, but it's being used by a number of local authorities across the country as well as a guide. It's a really clear document, and so definitely go to that one.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a document that we're aligning to in Essex on currently looking at our projects, so it's got a lot of really good information in there. Also, just to make people aware, we are in the autumn having a presentation on heat pumps by an independent consultant, so not a manufacturer, and that should be interesting to see what kind of things that they've got to say about installing heat pumps. So if you're a member of Spaces, you'll get information on that that will come out as part of our autumn program leading up to COP26, as we do more and more of these webinars. I'm just now looking through and seeing making sure that I've not missed anybody, because we've got a couple of questions that were combined. I think we've actually covered, Fiona, am I right? We've covered all the questions.
Yeah,
so far.
All the questions.
That's brilliant. That's really appreciated that people have contributed with questions, because it does make it a lot more interesting for everybody, to be fair. So thank you ever so much for that.
Greg, Richard has just come in with one last question. Richard Daniels.
Has he? Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Should private practice or government lead on the accreditation scheme needed?
As a fellow of CEBSE and a board member of CEBSE, I might be slightly biased, but I think you didn't really answer your question.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending this webinar. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our presenter Laura for an absolute excellent presentation, and our sponsors Atkins, Faithful and Gould, IES, MPS Group and Wilmot Dixon for their support. Can I just ask that you take a few seconds and answer the feedback question that's on the screen, and it's on a scale of 1 poor to 5 excellent. How would you rate this webinar? If you could just do that, it's the one question that we ask people to do, and that's really appreciated if you could do that for us. A reminder that all the webinars over the 2-week period are being recorded and will be loaded to the Spaces YouTube channel. Delegates and Spaces members will be sent a link at the end of the conference. The recordings are only available to delegates and Spaces members, so please circulate details of the conference to your friends, colleagues on LinkedIn, because we've got plenty more going on until the end of next week. Thank you all for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.